We are continuing our series, bringing together faith and work and mercy and justice, two concepts that are often thought about separately, but that we believe are deeply connected. And last week we had Russell Berry and Shannon Nelson Ty get us started by walking into this. But today I'm really excited to have my pastor and my good friend, John Dennis, who's going to help us think about collaborative leadership that restores, talking about collective impact for mercy and justice. John is the co-founder and senior pastor for Trinity Church. He has begun and continues to be on about 1 million different boards and organizations that are involved with justice and mercy in our city. And he also serves as the co-director of the executive team for City to City North America. We're also going to get to hear from two other incredible men, Michael Allen and David Dillon, who co-founded together Chicago, and among many, many other things that they have their hands in. I'm thrilled that you're going to get to hear from them. We're going to talk more about collective impact and about what's going on in Chicago, and they'll tell you a little bit more about themselves as well. Quick heads up on where we're going, and then I'm going to turn it over to John. John is going to share for a bit, then he's going to bring in Michael and David, and then we'll hope to have to leave some time for Q&A. So if you have questions as they're going along, you can feel free to drop those in the chat publicly, or you can send them just directly to me, and we'll try to get them. We'll try to get to those as we move towards the end of our time together. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John and let you take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. It's great to be here with all of you, and I'm thrilled to be able to talk on this topic today. And I'm also thrilled that Michael Allen and David Dillon are going to be here, and you're going to hear from them a little bit in a moment, talking about an organization called Together Chicago. And David, I'll ask you to go ahead and share the screen now if you would like to, and we'll just introduce the topics for today. That's an overview of where we're going. We'll scroll up to the first slide here. As Melissa said, we're going to be talking about work that restores. So that little subheader there says doing justly and loving mercy where you work. And if you've been around the church or been around scripture for a while, you'll know that that comes from what book of the Bible and what verse? Michael, tell me. It's Micah 6:8. He has shown thee, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of thee, but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. So what we're talking about is, how does work relate to Micah 6:8, or this idea of doing justice and loving mercy? And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide here, which is the topic for today is collaborative leadership. So part of what I have given myself to over the last 25 years is building teams that work well together and collaborate with one another in terms of pastoral teams and other teams as well. But what we want to think about is, how can this concept of collaborative leadership actually have an impact in the area of mercy and justice? And so we'll talk a little bit about Together Chicago, but what I really want to focus on first is that last word there on the screen, which is justice. David, you can go ahead and click through. The topic of justice has been a divisive one, especially for the last 15 months. So if you think about the death of George Floyd about 15, 16 months ago, there was kind of actually like a global response to his death. And yet what happened maybe 3 or 4 months later is that our culture started to kind of split politically in some ways on what justice really is. And there's a gentleman named Carl F.H. Henry who 70 years ago or so wrote a book on what he called the uneasy conscience of, he actually called it modern fundamentalism, but you could think of it as modern Protestant Christianity. And what he was observing even 70 years ago is that what used to be a world-changing message started to become a world-resisting message. In other words, what started happening, and it's happening a little bit in the last 18 months, is that our culture is polarizing in such a way that people on the right, so to speak, say, hey, we have to resist what's happening with the worldliness of the world. And people on the left are saying, how do we change all of the systems? And it's kind of divided us on this topic of what justice really is. So what I want to do is think a little bit about not justice as an economic concept or theological or a political concept. David, next slide. But a biblical concept. In other words, part of my premise is part of the reason why Christians have become divided on the topic of justice is because we are thinking primarily through a political lens or an economic lens rather than through a biblical or theological lens. So I'm actually going to ask, well, I guess no one else is unmuted, so I'll get to read this. But this is from Habakkuk chapter 1, which we studied on Sunday. Here's Habakkuk crying out, and you'll see the word justice in verse 4 occurs twice. But he's looking out the world and he says, look at, why do I see so much violence around me? Why do you make me, oh God, see iniquity and let me see what is wrong in the world? And then he says, the law is paralyzed, justice isn't going forth, the wicked surround the righteous, and justice goes forth perverted. So part of what this is pointing out is just this idea that justice is actually a concept that is deeply rooted in the Old Testament and deeply rooted in God's heart. I put down 2 Hebrew words there so you can learn a little bit of biblical languages today. The word there for justice relates to what you might call a collection of laws. It has to do with the laws that are passed to govern the country a little bit. It's a little more corporate. And the second word there, righteous, where it says the wicked surround the righteous, is a little more individual. And it has to do with the right relationships in every sphere. Go to the next slide. The next slide is just making this point that righteousness and justice are not just concepts in our culture today, but they're concepts that flow from God's character himself. So just 2 quotes from, and there's many, many times when righteousness and justice occur together. Here in Psalm 33, it says, the Lord loves righteousness, which is this idea of Zedekiah, or somebody having right relationships in all of the spheres of life. And he loves justice, this idea of mishpat, this idea of the right laws governing a country or a people group. The earth is full of steadfast love of the Lord. The second verse, Psalm 97, says that righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Anyway, all that is to point out is that justice and righteousness are part of the character of God. If you move to the next slide, David, what this slide shows is that justice and righteousness are therefore to be lived out. In other words, if God is a God of righteousness and justice, then he's concerned about the execution of justice in the scriptures and the way that we live our lives. If you see the second paragraph there, it says that he executes justice for the fatherless widow and loves the sojourner. There's a little triad that occurs in the Old Testament many, many times, which is the triad of the fatherless or the orphan, the widow, and the sojourner. All of those people are people that are displaced from a nuclear family or from the land. And what God says here is that he has a kind of impartiality to him, but he tells us to care for the poor in particular. I put a question at the bottom. If God is impartial, as it says in the first section, it says he's not partial, then why does he tell us to care for the poor? That is the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner. And the answer is, in part, is because he knows that we are partial, that we tend towards discrimination, that our eyes are blind to those who are the most needy. So part of what's happening in our culture, to summarize, is there's been this division in our culture on what justice is. And I just want to take us back for a moment to lay a theological foundation for the idea of justice that really has to do with God's heart for those who are overlooked, who are marginalized. We tend to think, if you're kind of situated on the right politically, you probably tend to think of poverty as being primarily something that comes about through loss of individual responsibility, through laziness and things like that, which the book of Proverbs talks much about. But if you're on the left, you probably tend to think a little bit about injustice as being something that is corporate, that is systemic. And the scriptures really talk about both sides of that and say that it's possible for there to be injustice in the laws, as well as poverty that comes upon people because of behavior and because of upbringing and training and things like that. What I want to do is, you can go to the next slide, David, is just remember that the scripture calls us to do this, to seek justice, to correct oppression. Keep going, David. To live this out. And it does it in really practical ways that we have to figure out how does that implemented in the world today. But as an example, if you look at Deuteronomy 24, it talks about not perverting justice, which is this word mishpat, and again, towards the sojourner and the widow. And it has this idea of gleaning, which is contained in the biblical concept of somebody reaping and then allowing there to be something that is left over for the poor. And so what in God's economy and God's culture, he created a culture in which those who are powerful, those who are wealthy, those who are rich actually do have compassion for those who are in the margins. And it goes all the way back to his character and the idea of justice. So I wanted to just lay a kind of biblical foundation for mercy and justice, but also just very briefly, my own part of the story of Together Chicago goes back to 2016, when there were 762 homicides in Chicago, 4,332 shootings in the city of Chicago. It was the worst year in 19 years in terms of homicide and violence. And a number of us in the city began feeling like God was putting on our hearts the responsibility to do something about that and to ask, isn't there something more that could be done by the church if we cooperated together in the area of mercy and justice? Next slide, David. So David and Michael are going to tell a little bit about the founding of Together Chicago, but it really comes back to these questions. How do we live out justice and righteousness in restorative ways together? And then what does it look like to provide collaborative leadership that restores? There was a group called, there was a movement in the 1990s called the Boston Miracle, that where they had seen a 60% drop in violence in the 90s, that a number of us began studying, and they had something called the 10-point plan, and essentially they mobilized politicians, Christians, faith leaders, business leaders into something that you might call collective impact. And so a number of us began exploring this concept in about 2016, and that's kind of when Together Chicago was founded. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael and to David, and they'll tell that story a little bit based on that kind of theological foundation of how do we now think about collective impact or collaborative leadership that engages in mercy and justice. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, John. If it's okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Just want to say hello to everyone. I'm David Dillon. I am an entrepreneur in Chicago. I run a series of technology businesses. And as John said, my heart was really stirred, particularly in the year 2016, but even starting before that, just seeing how Chicago had come to be built and reading a lot of books. And I didn't grow up in the US. Actually, I grew up overseas in Japan and spent 17 years as a missionary kid there, and came to the US in the early 70s. And just my heart started to learn, about how Chicago was formed. And there's a book, by the way, I highly recommend, called Family Properties, that really kind of goes into great detail. It's very well researched and explains a lot of the injustice that John's used this word justice a lot. And there's been a lot of injustice that's happened in Chicago and other major cities in our country. And in 2016, John and I and a total of 12 leaders started praying and just asking God, is there something more that the body of Christ could do? You think about the city of Chicago, it's a city of 3 million people approximately, and where it's about 1/3 African-American, 1/3 white, 1/3 Hispanic, with literally thousands of churches. We don't know exactly, but it's probably close to 3,000 churches in Chicago. And there's, hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million Christians in Chicago. You think about, what if we came together in some way to work together? And obviously that would break all kinds of norms in the sense that, the white church doesn't really know the African-American church very well, and none of us know the Hispanic church very well. And we might know an individual here or there, but even if we knew someone, we don't really work together in a collective way. And so my heart was really stirred around that question. And at that time, through a mutual friend, I met Michael Allen, who's now become a friend and my co-partner in this endeavor. Michael, why don't you pick it up from there and start talking about your part of that?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. And so I had a similar journey with David, like David had. I was a pastor on the north side of the city of Chicago, and gun violence came to the door of our church when 5 people were gunned down outside of our church on a Monday night while we were feeding the homeless and the poor in our community. And I really, God just would not let me get that incident behind me until I was ready and willing to face the issues of gun violence, what was driving the violence, and how the church could have some impact on that. And so I started working with a guy named Chris Millette, who was working in the violence reduction space. And a buddy of mine, Vance Henry, introduced me to him. Vance worked in the mayor's office and still does. He's served now 3 different mayors in our city. And Vance said, hey, you got to get to meet this guy, Chris Millette. He's doing some work that you might be interested based on what happened at your church. And so I started also meeting with a group of influential leaders across the city, asking hard questions about the violence. And that led David and I to meet together and join our groups together, praying and asking God to give us some answers and then help us find a way forward. And that's how Together Chicago was formed. And it was a thing that God did in all of our hearts, really just helping us to realize this is a big problem. It's a complicated problem. And no one denomination, no one church, no one entity in society is going to solve this. But if we came together, we may be able to have some collective solutions for collective impact. And so that's where really Together Chicago came about. And it's been an incredible journey. 4 years later, God is helping us to focus on one particular neighborhood, although we have some of our initiatives spread out around the city. We're focused here in West Haven Park, where our new office is, and we are working and seeing some amazing results. God is really blessing the work and establishing the work of our hands here.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to pop up the screen again, and just we'll kind of keep on with the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of collective impact, sort of what is it and kind of where does it come from? Well, I know for myself personally, I was really influenced by a paper that was written and published in 2014 by a part of Stanford University. And it was a really seminal paper for me, where it kind of created this whole concept of that there are actually aspects of something called collective impact that you can actually aspire to. And the 5 aspects are having a common agenda across organizations. As Michael said, no one part of society is going to solve this by itself, right? So it's going to take multiple parts working together. So you have to have a common agenda. You have to have shared measurement. You have to have mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and having a backbone support organization. And as Michael and I got talking about this, we realized, there might be some degree of some of the other 4, but there really wasn't, to our knowledge, a backbone support organization that said, our mission is not to get a lot of credit for ourselves. Our mission is to collectively organize across a number of different parts of society. So the parts that we really want to organize across are churches. As I mentioned, there's thousands of churches. By God's grace, we now have about 150 churches we're working closely with in some way. Nonprofit organizations, there's, as you know, many great nonprofit organizations in Chicago, both faith-based and non-faith-based, and we're working with many of them. Businesses, city government and state government, and public and private schools. All those parts of the community have to come together. And that government part's super important. We need to work closely with our government partners. That includes the police department, obviously, and they've become a very close partner of ours. So through a lot of discussion and prayer, we decided that there's really kind of based on the church being the kind of the bedrock of all this, there's 4 different things we wanted to work on. The 4 things are economic development, education, what we call gospel justice centers, and reducing the violence. And we don't have enough time to go in depth to all 4 of these, or the 5th one being the faith-based community development. But I'll just talk a little bit about the economic development part of that. Actually, before I do that, this is a picture of our team. And so, in fact, this is a little dated. We actually now have 34 folks on our team. We started with Michael and I, basically, in 2017. And by God's grace, it's grown. And you can see it's a very diverse team, which we're really thrilled with. And it's really one of the things that's given us some of the insight and blessing into the communities that we've been working in. So within economic development, what we're trying to do is really attract and grow local businesses that produce competitive goods and services. And so it kind of goes back to, when all this started, I remember praying and asking the Lord, like, well, what do I have to contribute to this? These problems have been there for decades. They seem like intractable problems. And the thing that kept coming back to me was this from Exodus 4:2, when God was talking to Moses, and God said to Moses, well, what's in your hand, right? And what was in his hand at the time was a shepherd's staff. And I felt like God was saying that to me, well, what's in your hand? And what was in my hand was, I'm a business guy. I run a series of tech companies. They're successful. We have about 400 people. And I've learned a lot about running businesses and just organizing processes and organizations. And I felt God say to me, well, you can do that, So having a business, and that's, I think, how this fits into this whole discussion here today is, what are the skills that God's given each of us? So what we're trying to do is sort of apply those business skills into the Chicago context in a way to kind of really deal with the injustice that's happening. So we're trying to incent businesses to join us. We're trying to do workforce development, and we're actually doing all those things. Let me kind of talk to you about one really interesting partnership we have with Rush Hospital and a number of these organizations on this picture. So Rush Hospital had literally for 10 years, have been trying to figure out how to buy locally on the near west side. They spend about $500 million in their supply chain and had been working on this literally for 10 years, had not been able to really find a significant way to find local businesses that they could purchase from. They found out about Together Chicago and asked us to work with them. And they actually put us under contract, which we're still under that today. We've been doing this for over 2 years now. And so there's one of our leaders is a guy named Shelby Parchman. He is an African-American entrepreneur, and he was very skilled in exactly this idea. And so he and our team have been working together, and we've found now a series of businesses that are supplying into this kind of supply chain opportunity. And what we love about this is not charity. This is real business. And it's taken a lot of work to kind of mentor both sides. The big Rush Hospital bureaucracy wants things to be done a certain way. The small entrepreneurs don't always know how to do it that way. And so there's been a lot of false starts. But through all that, it's actually come through. And now we have a whole series of, law firms and tech firms and, all kinds of food companies, repair companies, automotive companies are now supplying goods and services to Rush Hospital. So that's one of the things we've been doing. Here's another slide that kind of talks about that. Another thing we've been working on is affordable housing. When we say affordable housing, we don't mean sort of the Section 8 type style affordable housing. We mean good homes that you and I would want to live in, that we want to get people in the community into. And so this is a slide of one of the designs we've been working on. We have a whole series of initiatives around trying to get people into an equity position. We've been working with banks and lenders and all sorts of people. And this is a big area. There's a lot of people working on this, but but it's a really interesting opportunity to get people into homes. Because as you know, the American dream for a lot of people is you buy a home and the value of the home appreciates, and that appreciation is often what funds multi-generational wealth and the ability for people to go to college, et cetera, et cetera. And so we want that to happen for our communities. It's the exact opposite of what happened, as you can, when you read about that book, Family Properties. The wealth was stolen from the community, not given to the community. So we want to reverse that flow. Here's another picture of a kitchen. All right, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Michael. We have a lot to talk about in this violence reduction space. So Michael,
Yeah.
take it away.
Yeah, thanks, David. And so one of the things that we do in trying to reduce violence, we take a holistic approach. So the business incubation and opportunities that David described is all part of it. We recognize that almost every crime that is committed, not only in Chicago, but around the country, has a financial aspect to it. And so that's why economic development is so important in our strategy. But a more detailed approach, going to the heart of those who are perpetrating violence, is street outreach, targeted family interventions, and then faithful presence. And so the street outreach part, we've basically been able, through one of our co-workers, Tio Hardiman, he has helped us connect with a lot of the street organizations, also might be known as gangs, some call them tribes. And there are many tribal leaders who really are somewhat retired. They're still connected in some way to their tribe, and they'll probably always be connected to their tribe, but they no longer want to continue to do things that are negative and destructive in their community. Matter of fact, many of them have told me, we want to help rebuild the community that we destroyed in some ways. And so our street outreach workers are those young men, sometimes actually middle-aged men even, who have survived the street life and are retired and want to do something positive. And so they come into our organization with a lot of history and a lot of know-how and influence with the guys who are currently still on the streets doing negative things. And so they try to influence those young men with our direction to come out of the gangs and participate and utilize the resources that we have and we can connect them to. So we work with a whole series of nonprofit entities, social services providers that we connect these participants to. We call them participants, those who want to get out of the pathway of self-destruction and community destruction to some place that is positive and healthy, and we get them into that. So that's the whole street outreach piece. And then targeted family interventions. We know that when people in these communities are affected by violence, whether a mother, father, sister, brother, son, daughter is killed, we then are there to help support those families in a host of different ways, from helping to pay for their funerals, helping to find them grief counseling, providing groceries or whatever is needed during their time of grief and pain. We're there to help them through, and that's targeted family interventions for those families affected by the violence. And then faithful presence. We encourage and mobilize, we help the church to really re-engage their community, especially the families that are involved and victims of violence or perpetrators of violence. So we are the link between the churches in the community and the community itself, and helping the church really rediscover this mission field that is right around them. And so we mobilize, we train and mobilize the churches to have a faithful presence in their own communities. And then sometimes tying communities together from the south side to the north side, west side, et cetera, where churches are coming together and even crossing geographical boundaries to help be a faithful presence in the community. We have something called Night Church. We have another thing called the Chicago Peace Campaign. And then you probably have heard of some of the things through Chicagoland United in Prayer, some of those activities throughout the summer where we gather, Hands Across Chicago, et cetera. Those are faithful presence events. Some of them are seasonal, some of them are weekly, monthly, et cetera, that are happening. And because we believe when the church shows up in person, sort of like how God showed up in person on planet Earth in the person of Jesus Christ, that incarnational ministry, that's the idea for faithful presence. And then custom notifications. We've trained over a dozen pastors to work with our police department in visiting the guys responsible in their communities for pulling triggers. Police, we use the police to give us entree into these guys, the They have actionable information. They know who the guys are that are causing the problems. And they schedule us to go with them, the police commanders, the highest ranking official in every district. We ride with them, going to visit these guys door to door, and to give them a message, which is a custom notification that you are loved by God and us. You have a purpose that is higher than you're currently exhibiting, and we want to show you how to fulfill God's purpose for your life, and give you a pathway out of this life that only ends one of two ways: a box in the ground or a box with wires. And so the police then gives them a customized notification of, listen, we know who you are, and we're going to stop you if you make us, but here's Pastor Allen and company. They will help you if you let them. And so the police gives them a message of warning, sort of the stick, and we give a message of hope, that is the carrot or the olive branch of peace and a way out of this cycle of violence. And that's the custom notification piece there. And then you can see here, the custom notification is happening all over the city. We are responsible for Area 3. You can look at the map. Right along the lakefront from Bronzeville all the way up to Rogers Park, we have 6 different districts that we're responsible as a partner with the police department exclusively for that area. And then we have other organizations like TC, Together Chicago, like RISE on the west side, Build in Area 4, Centers for New Horizons, they're in Area 1, and then Safer Foundation, they're in Area 2. We all collaborate together, working with CPD, to help disrupt and interrupt the violence and help people get on a path to new horizons, and that's peaceful and healthy for them and their families and their community. And so that's what we do there. And then Communities Partnering with Peace. This is part of the Metropolitan Family Services. That is probably the premier and the largest organization that's working in the violence reduction space. And they have found and basically collected and collaborated with all the other organizations like Together Chicago that are working in this violence reduction space. And they are heavily funded by city, state, and federal governments. And then they take that funding and distribute it to different organizations that are working in the violence reduction space. So it's called CP4P, or Communities Partnering for Peace. Again, please notice this whole idea of community, of partnering, of collective impact. All throughout this presentation, you're going to see examples of how different organizations are working together to accomplish a common goal, and using their own unique, distinctive approaches, and learning from each other. Cross-pollination is happening, and we meet and talk and share best practices and celebrate each other and what's happening. So it's really it's a new day in Chicago. That's all I can say, and I'm so grateful that this formerly divided city has found a way, by God's grace, to come together around this very, very stubborn problem of violence and trying to do something positive.
David and Michael, let me break in and just ask a couple questions.
Sure.
If that's all right, and kind of kick off a little Q&A for everyone. But one question I'll ask you right off the bat is, say something about some of the newest hires at Together Chicago and where that came from in terms of the street presence. Just a little story, anecdote, if you don't mind there.
No, I don't mind at all. In fact, this picture that you're seeing is a perfect picture to talk about that. So the gentleman on the left-hand side, 2 down from the police officer. By the way, that police officer is Commander Sheemash. Michael knows her very well. She's extremely supportive. But the African-American gentleman, 2 down from him with the blue shirt on, is Tio Hardiman. Tio Hardiman's been a leader in violence reduction in Chicago for a long time. He's joined our team, and he's just been a godsend. He has tremendous knowledge and insight into the community. We're just so grateful for him. And he's been the one that's hand-selected the street outreach workers because of his personal knowledge. He grew up in that community and has tremendous credibility. And then we also just hired a woman named Marcinia Richards, who's also grown up in that community. She has a tremendous wealth of knowledge, also an African-American leader. So God's just really bringing to us just amazing team members who have great insight and way beyond what I certainly would know. Michael,
David, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, tell this quick story of the person who was converted through this work?
Oh yeah, Michael, please.
Concept.
Michael, that's a question for Michael.
Yeah, thanks, John. Several weeks ago, one of our street outreach workers, who is a former chief, but very, very still influential in one of the tribes here in West Haven Park, I invited him up to a camp in Michigan. It's a camp associated with, in fact, let's see if he's in this picture. He is not in this picture, but these are some of our street outreach workers that now work with us and some of the guys that are in their tribe. But this gentleman, he brought his whole family up to Michigan for this Labor Day weekend family camp retreat. And I brought my wife and youngest daughter with us. And I'm telling you, every single chapel service, there were 6 chapel services, morning and evening. And then we had several meals together, breakfast, lunch, and dinner over the weekend. And the gospel was shared in so many different ways. And we talked about husband and wife and children, family, from a biblical perspective. And every worship service, this couple was wiping away tears from their eyes as we sat in the back of the auditorium, just listening and participating in the worship service. And then in the mealtime, they said to us, this place has got to be bugged. This has to be bugged. Every conversation my wife and I have privately about what's going on in our marriage, what's going on with our kids, the next day or the next chapel service, the speaker is talking about it as if he heard everything we said in our cabin. So we're looking around the cabin saying there's got to be a camera in here somewhere, a listening device, because God is reading our mail, and he's definitely speaking to our hearts. And so Labor Day, Monday morning after the last chapel service, my wife and I shared our testimony and the gospel with them, and they prayed to receive Christ with tears in their eyes. And Lavana said to me, he said, Pastor, I think God wants me to be a missionary to my tribe. So he comes back to Chicago Labor Day afternoon, and he's telling his guys what happened to him and his wife and his 2 kids at the camp over the weekend. He said, half of my guys were angry with me, and the other half of my guys said, hey, tell me more about this Jesus thing. Whatever happened to you, we want more of that. The next day, I was preaching in chapel at Moody Bible Institute at President's Chapel in Torrey Gray Auditorium. And I said, hey, Lavanis, you want to come with me to chapel and hear me preach? He never heard me preach before. He said, Pastor, I'll be there. He showed up in the chapel. Afterwards, he comes down. There's a big guy, about 6'6", maybe 300 pounds. And I mean, I'm glad he's on our team. Let me put it that way, all right? And he goes, this was an amazing message. This is great. He says, so this is Moody Bible Institute. I've heard about this place all my life. I grew up just a couple miles west of here, but I've never set foot on the campus. And now here I am in chapel, listening to you preach. This is just awesome. So now he's going to be we want to create a pipeline from Chicago up to that camp. He says, God is in that camp at Life Action Ministries there in Buchanan, Michigan. And he says, I want to bring guys up here. And we have a plan that we're working on to get a bunch of guys up to the camp for a similar experience that he had. So keep praying that God will just create a pathway of discipleship up there to the camp.
Amen. Thank you, Michael. What kind of surveillance devices were you guys using up at that camp, Michael? Just teasing. Michael's got to jump in just a second, but we're gonna draw to a close here. If you have any questions you want to ask, we welcome anybody to put a question in the chat. If you would like to ask a question, let me just say 2 things very quickly. One is, David, if you could share the percent of violence that's been reduced in the project that you're working on right now.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, John. So this slide here is taken literally from a new data portal that the City of Chicago and the University of Chicago have created. It's a fantastic data portal. We can send that link out to all of you, and you can slice and dice the violence statistics every different way. One way you can now do it that's brand new is you can slice it by street outreach organization. And so this is our near west side area, and this is a true year over year, 2020 to 2021. You can see by God's grace, the homicides are down by 60%, and the total shooting victimizations are down by 43.8%. That's just a God work. It's not something we could have come up with. But at the same time, District 12, let me show you the next slide. This is District 12, which West Haven Park is part of. Our part used to be the most violent part of District 12. look at the overall statistics for right around us, it's up 58% for homicides, where we're down 60%. So we're just so grateful. I mean, God is clearly doing something through us in this community, and we're really grateful for that.
Thanks, David. One comment, and then Melissa has a question. The main comment is this for all of us as listeners. The idea of collective impact is very simple. It's that you have a skill that God has given to you that you're using, say, in your profession. And if you match up with somebody else in a different profession and then say, what problems do we want to try to solve, say, in the city? That's kind of where this came from. Is it leaders just saying, hey, I'm going to reach out to somebody who's in a little bit of a different profession, try to work on solving a problem together, and then see where God leads it. So Melissa, go ahead. You have a question for David.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. This has been so fantastic just to hear and learn more of what's going on. David, I was thinking about what you said towards the beginning, just your own story about sort of looking at what's in your hand. And John was just alluding to this too. But I'm thinking about, people who are listening, who are thinking about, so what were maybe some of those next steps for you as you thought about, like, this is what I have to offer. What does that look like to sort of go from there?
Yeah, great question. Well, at the time, what it meant for me was just pulling together this team of folks that I highly respected, just to have conversations about it. A lot of people have been thinking about this, of course, for decades. So I wanted to kind of draw on everyone's experience. But at this point, I mean, if someone's interested in this whole category, there's a lot of specific things that we could talk about if you want to contact us offline. But I think a lot of it's just, this idea of what's your skill, what's your passion. We have needs for business people, for attorneys, for people just to kind of be involved, just mentoring kids. We have a whole education program. So kind of the whole thing is kind of just back to what skills has God given you and where's your passion, and try to find a way to use that. In addition, I mean, for me, didn't mean leaving my professional work. I'm still running the tech companies, but God's given me the ability to do this as well. So I'm really grateful for that.
I appreciate that. I think that's one of the things that we want to emphasize is that, one of the starting places for faith and work and living justly and with mercy, as John talked about at the beginning, is in the context of your own work, your own workplace, the people you work with, the people that you serve. And then there's another layer where you can think about what are the skills, the platforms, the resources, the expertise, the networks that God has given me, and how do I think about leveraging those on behalf of, those who might be marginalized or have, in some of these areas that you guys are working in. And so I love kind of the focus on both, the opportunity that you're offering as well. What is the best way if people say, I want to get connected to something I heard, something that the violence reduction or education, is it through the website?
Yeah.
Together Chicago?
Yeah, the website has a really good place where you can just indicate your interest in which of the 5 areas you're interested in. Just go there, and it comes to the leadership of Together Chicago. I see every single email that comes through, and we do a pretty good job, I think, of connecting folks. And so we'd love to connect you to different parts of our work. One other thing I'll just mention is one of the big things we do is try to pray together on a regular basis. And we have an annual major prayer event that's coming up in January. In the past, we've gotten around 2,000 people there, and we've been streaming sometimes another 1,000 or 2,000 beyond that. But that's going to be at the New Life Church in Chicago on the near west side. And so we'd love to have you join us there. There'll be a lot more information about that. But there's lots of ways to get involved, many, many different ways.
Fantastic.
Good, David.
I'm going to go ahead and drop the website there, togetherchicago.com. Maybe this is my opportunity too to say that our hope is to do something more, to hear more about what Together Chicago is doing and to highlight some of these different areas. Even in January, we might connect with you guys about doing another series where we could dive a little bit deeper into each of those areas that you're involved with. So hopefully we'll get to continue, even as we continue to think about how faith and work and mercy and justice are deeply intertwined. I'd love to connect with you guys further. So
we would love to do that. And there's a lot to say about each of the 5 areas. So if you have interest, we'd love to do that.
Fantastic. John, any closing thoughts from you as we wrap up?
Yeah, the main thing I would say is don't be discouraged about all of the challenges of the world, and think about your own opportunity to be salt and light where you are, to be a witness for Christ, and have a long-term perspective about what God might do in you and through you. You want to be a witness for him, and one of the ways to do that is to care about those who are on the edges, who are more marginalized or are powerless. And sometimes that might mean simply buying somebody a meal that's nearby you, who's looking for something. And sometimes it might be a project that you're working on and collaborating on. So just want to encourage you and charge you to continue to be the presence of Christ in your neighborhoods and in your profession. And really thank you, David and Michael, for your encouragement today. And I'll say one last thing on Together Chicago. The information is a little overwhelming, but part of what's been happening is that many fragmented activities that were happening in the city, somebody praying in Englewood every night for 5 years or 10 years. Part of what's been happening is people are unifying together and saying, how do we spread this across the city? So when David says it's a new day in Chicago, there is a lot of truth to that there are people that are working together across the whole city that were working on their own, but in fragmented ways. So there is a tremendous sense of unity and collaboration in the city. And my prayer is also that it'll begin to infect the politics and various neighborhoods that will be renewed in the days to come. So don't be discouraged about the challenges, but continue to press on. And thank you for being here and being salt and light in your neighborhood and in your profession as well.
Absolutely. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap up there and give you a chance to get back to your offices or your desk, as it may be, or maybe it's to scarf down lunch in the 6 minutes before your lunch ends. But absolutely, thank you so much to everyone joining us today. Those of you who are in the office, thanks for coming in. Thanks for joining us online, and grateful as well for those who are watching the replay. We can't make it on Tuesdays, but John and David, and also to Michael, who had to leave, thank you so much for being part of this today. It's really a blessing just to learn from your wealth of wisdom and experience. I think you've given us a lot to think about and connect with. Love to have all of you back next week. Again, whether you can join us in person or online. We're going to welcome Missy Wallace, who directs the Global Faith and Work Initiative through City to City. And she's going to talk to us about faith and work amidst brokenness. We're also going to get to hear a testimonial from Ben Nussbaum and how he's living this out through his work and the work that he's involved with here in Chicago. So we hope to see each of you back then, and have a great afternoon. We will be praying for you as you live out your faith in and through your work today. So see you next week. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.